Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. And this is us, Small Churches in Action podcast. And today we have another guest, one who is actually sitting in a beautiful area of the country that is just loving water right now as floods happen and is just enjoying continuing pandemic life. So we want to talk about a number of things in this session today, but first I'm just going to let her introduce herself and a little bit of her own ministry journey. Well, you can go for as long as you want on that. If it's too long, we'll cut you off, but okay, it's all yours, April. Oh, sorry, you're supposed to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you so much. As we were chatting earlier, any one of our stories of ministry could take a whole podcast, but we'll try not to do that today. My name is April Yamasaki. I'm a writer and pastor with 10 published books and lots of articles published also, 25 years of congregational ministry. Some of those books were published before I was called as a pastor, and some of them during my years of pastoral ministry. I loved my church. I loved serving as a pastor in the same congregation for 25 years, which is another whole story. But as that writing and publishing side continued to open up for me, I felt what I think of as a new wind of the Spirit blowing in my life to resign from my church and to invest more deeply in my writing and speaking side of ministry. So I'm now still writing and publishing books and articles. I worked as an editor for a small Christian magazine until the financial pressures of the pandemic forced the magazine to close.
Hmm.
I speak at different churches and other venues 2 to 3 times a month. That includes once a month in my role as resident author with Valley Crossway Church, which is a small liturgical worship community here in Abbotsford, British Columbia. And I've just finished teaching a 6-week course on prayer during challenging times for a Canadian Mennonite University online. So that constellation of
That is a
different writing,
constellation.
speaking, and related things. It's more like being a pastor at large than
Mhm.
being a congregational pastor. But, for me, I feel just as much called to that as I ever did called to pastoral ministry.
Yeah. Well, now, when you moved into writing, I mean, you moved from pastoring, which you were enjoying, and you moved into writing. You saw a new passion. Can you walk us a little bit through that movement of from one place to the next place? Let's put it that way. The transition that happened.
Well, I was called to pastoral ministry in an unexpected way, and I left in really an unexpected way too, because I loved ministry, I loved the church, and one day I was talking to one of our congregational members in the hallway. I had no thought at that point of leaving, and I had a sudden impression. It was so strong, I almost said it out loud. I'm really going to miss you when I'm gone. And I thought, where did that
Where did
come
that
from?
go?
And I didn't say anything, but over time that grew. And then I had written quite a bit during my ministry, but at odd hours, early in the morning,
Mhm.
late at night, on vacation, on my sabbatical time. I had some release time from the church for writing, which I was very thankful for. But I'd kind of run out of that. I had finished a sabbatical within the last couple of years, so I didn't have another one. But I got another offer to write a book of sermons,
Hmm.
and I was already doing something else at the time. I had said no, but they came back to me next year and said, we're even going to push the deadline if you would work on this project. And I thought, this seems like a new call from God then to
Hmm.
leave after, I'd been there for 25 years in the same
Yeah.
church. So to move on from that, to step out in faith, I had a handful of speaking opportunities. I had some writing opportunities. I had a book contract, and felt that spirit nudging me forward. So that's how I made the leap. But I also knew for me, so much of my writing and speaking was grounded in the church.
Mhm.
And I wanted to have a home base. So I kind of looked around to see what might be possible, and ended up having a resident author arrangement with this small congregation. It's about maybe a quarter of the size of the church that I had been pastoring. It was a church that did not have any paid pastoral staff,
Mhm.
lay led, liturgical focus, and they were open to trying something new. So I am there as resident author, which means I am happy to preach there once a month with them. I do some community building, and that provides good grounding for
Yeah.
the rest of what I'm doing.
That, okay, my background includes that whole I will call it a brethren or brethren in Christ background of the idea of just a group that gets together. We don't necessarily have paid pastoral, but we're excited and innovative and creative. Would you say that's how this church sees you as a writer in residence?
I'm not sure. My husband and I visited there after I had already shared my resignation with the church, but we hadn't, made firm decisions yet. And we thought, well, we'll go and we'll visit
Mhm.
that church as one possibility. And we had visited they rent space in another church, and so we'd also visited that church just to see there might be some possibility of maybe even my working together with both of them. But the first time that we visited Valley Crossway, this is a church that creates their own liturgy every Sunday using lots of different resources, but putting that together. And we walked in and were handed a bulletin sized little booklet, but it was 30 pages. That was their liturgy. And I
Okay.
thought, wow, this is a church that loves words.
Hmm.
And I knew the person who happened to be speaking that morning, not well, but I knew him from other church connections, and he said, "Oh, we should have you speak here sometime."
Yeah.
And so I said, "Well, I have kind of an idea that I'd like to share with you." And so that started this idea of having a resident author partnership. I had gotten that idea from another church in Edmonton that had a resident poet, and looked at kind of how they were working with that, and that sparked this idea. And I'm so glad that they were open to trying it. We said, well, let's try it for a year and we'll see. And now we are into it. Well, that was in 2019. So we're still
Yeah.
partnering together in this way.
Now I'm listening to this and I'm thinking to myself, here is a way to move into soul care, caring for yourself, caring for moving into your passion, dealing with that whole area. Um, yeah. How has was that part of what happened with that whole movement at that time?
Well, to the extent that it meant I think, okay, so I feel this sense of God to invest more deeply in my writing, and that can be done in lots of different ways.
Mhm.
But for me, the prospect of visiting church after church after church, which of course I love visiting different
Oh yeah.
churches, but to feel, I said, well, but if I did that for as many churches as I could visit, different, week after week after week, I could do that for over a year. But do I really want to be a visitor for extended period of time? It's one thing to visit, but I felt for me and for my husband, we needed a church home, people that would come around us, that would pray for us, that we would be able to pray for them, that we would be at home somewhere. And so that's, um, when I think of soul care, I think it's paying attention then to what do we need. And I think for myself, I needed that sense of home. So for me, that was very important to think of that kind of soul care, but also a way of contributing to the church. So both,
Yeah.
and I'm convinced that good soul care, good self care for ourselves is also good community care, and it needs to be that.
Okay, you're verging into something that in the podcast that I've been doing is it just pervades part of it. And I've talked with one side. Let me talk to about another side of that is that small churches live on relationships. And if you aren't willing to be in relationship, a small church is not a good place to be. Now, in the midst of that relationship, you have to care for others, but also care for yourself. And so let me ask you a question, particularly for those that are leading and pastors and that type of thing. what are some practical ways that they can care for themselves in order that they can care for others? Practical things that they can be doing.
After I had been in my church for 22 years,
Mhm.
I wrote a little article, 22 best practices in 22 years of pastoral ministry.
Ah,
And I
that
just
was
wrote down this laundry list of
yeah,
things I thought were my best practices. And as I look back at that now, I realize that was full of things that I would now think of as soul care or as self care as we think
yeah,
about care for our heart and soul and mind and strength. From the words of Jesus, to love God with all of our personhood, heart,
yeah,
soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so, to root our soul care, our self care in that kind of Christ centered framework. And I thought, wow, so many of these things that I wrote down are really practical things that I found very helpful for myself and that also relate to soul care. So, the first thing I wrote down is do what you love. And I
mhm,
think it's another version of what you and I talked about just as we chatted before the podcast started, that how important it is to feel called to
yeah,
whatever it is that we are doing. So for me, that was perhaps the beginning. But I also wrote down journal to reflect on scripture, to pray, to write poetry, to
mhm,
dream, to rant, to debrief, all of those things. Have a great support system. Sometimes we need not just a journal, but we need people that we can
yeah,
also rant and debrief with, and to do that freely. Think of what that might mean in terms of church or family or friends or colleagues. I wrote down pray, read scripture, not just for sermon preparation or to lead a Bible study, but if the word doesn't move me and transform me, then how will that impact other people? How can I possibly share it in that way? I wrote down something very practical about aiming to arrive early for any appointments instead of just rushing to get there and then rushing in. I tried to have those extra moments in between appointments or before appointments just to think about things, to pray, to organize my thoughts, take some deep breaths, just another way of taking what I call a sacred pause in
mhm,
the midst of life. To eat healthy, to be physically active, to track your time. In ministry, I find it's very easy to blur the lines so that it feels like you're always working, even if you're really not. And so, tracking time, I find, is helpful just to clarify boundaries and to make room for Sabbath time, which benefits both the church and family life and your own soul. Invest in ongoing learning. When I
mhm,
began as a pastor, I actually had no training or experience in pastoral care. So I focused all of my professional development there. I had some development time from the church, so I did that. And now I would put more weight then and gradually put more weight equally on sort of biblical theological
right.
learning and the practical nuts and bolts of ministry, both. Also on my list was go home for lunch. I
Oh,
lived
good
close enough
idea.
to the church that I could do that. And, just don't make every lunch a working lunch or
Mhm,
a ministry lunch, but to take a break, do errands. Sometimes I would just come home and have lunch and play the piano. And I play the piano very poorly. And that's one reason why I love it, just to be able to play piano and not worry about what anyone else thinks about it. Take all of your eligible vacation time. I read a statistic that 43% of working Canadians do not take all of their vacation days. And I'm not one of them.
mhm,
I took them all. Um, hold ministry lightly. In one of my journals, I think this was a ranting day, but I started a list of jobs I could do other than pastoring. So I
mhm.
wrote down college teaching, which I did before being called into pastoral ministry, temporary office work, which I also did pre-pastoring, and working in a bookstore, which I've never done, but used to be one of my dream jobs.
Oh, that would
So,
be fun.
hold ministry lightly. It's God's call on our lives, and we don't have to be holding it quite so tightly as we sometimes do. Have a life apart from the church, have hobbies that you enjoy, have a social and family life, apart from the church. And that might be more challenging if you're in a, particularly if you're in a small church in a small town. But for me, that was important. And discover a sense of wonder
Hmm.
again and again. And before I started pastoring, one of my biggest fears was that once I became more involved in the church in a pastoral way instead of as a congregational member, that perhaps as I became more deeply involved, I might become more cynical about the church. But but I found that that didn't happen. I actually found a deeper compassion for woundedness and
Mm.
a greater wonder at God's grace. And I think that's important to discover, rediscover over and over again that sense of wonder.
Yeah. Woundedness and wonder. I think that's a great combination. Man, I, I guess my own life has included, as I'm pastoring, the passing of my wife. And there was a grief time, no question about that, and great support groups. I learned so many things during that time about caring for myself, because it would have been easy, and it was easy, to be quite honest, just to go and move ahead at twice the speed, expecting that that would take care of everything. But I needed good soul care in order to continue on and to be resilient. And I mean, that seems to be a word that's coming up more and more, is this whole question of resiliency in pastors. What does that mean? What do you understand that to mean?
I've noticed it too, that word coming up, and I've seen a few definitions. So, resilience is bouncing back from trauma, or
Mhm.
resilience is the ability to adapt in changing circumstances. But I think of resilience mainly as that inner strength to face whatever it is, whether it's trauma, whether it's changing circumstances, whatever challenges we might have in life. And I think that, as you've discovered, good soul care is vital to develop that kind of resilience. And good community care is vital, that we have people around us where we both give and receive care. And of course, relying on God, for all of our theories and practices of soul care, when those fail us and when other people, being human, can't always be there for us in the way that we might hope for, we still rely on God's faithfulness. When I first went into ministry, because I was called out of the congregation and without previous experience, and the church had gone through some major difficulties, I asked our conference minister if he would be willing to meet with me periodically as I began into pastoral ministry. And, I didn't know any better that I wasn't supposed to ask that, because other pastors later said to me, well, how did you ever get that kind of time for the conference minister? Because they're always so busy. I said, well,
Yeah.
I didn't know any better. I asked, and he agreed to that. And one of the things, though, that I remember him saying to me, he said, when you feel like running, then run to Jesus.
Mm.
And that, I think, has still stayed with me, that, for whatever resilience we can build, whatever soul care we might practice, when we feel like running, and those times will come, whether we're, running from a particular ministry challenge or running from a difficult personal challenge that we don't want to go through, then run to Jesus.
Now, I'm just thinking of a number of the people that sit in my congregation that I'm currently working with, and others that I'm touching base with. And I think of resilience and soul care. What have you found as you've been talking with people that is the greatest concern that they seem to have with soul care? I could maybe expand that question, but maybe I'll just leave it open and come back with questions after that. But,
I find that some don't really see the need.
hmm.
Some see the need, but feel so pressed with more things to do, and few resources, they're not sure how they would be able to do that. And I I have great empathy for that because we are in the midst of an ongoing pandemic.
Yeah.
Here in our area, churches have been able to meet for worship and not worry about the mask mandate, where in public indoor spaces here in our area, masks have been required, but not for church worship. Well, yesterday that changed.
Hmm.
So last Sunday, we didn't necessarily have to have masks in worship. Now this Sunday, we will need to do that. So that is, an added pressure to keep
Oh,
adapting and
definitely.
keep responding to the ongoing pandemic. We have massive flooding here in BC, mainly on the other side of the city from where we are. But, farms are underwater. People
Oh,
have had their homes washed away. A few people in our church have had to evacuate. So there's these worldwide crises, the more local crises, and then in our personal lives, as you shared the passing of your wife, and now my husband is going through active cancer treatment, all of those things happening, and of course the never ending ministry of the church, where there is always one more meeting, one more Bible study and sermon to prepare, one more pastoral care visit. And with all of those pressures, how to find that time for soul care. And I think part of it is um, developing those regular habits in times where there is less crisis, and then those habits can help us during times that are more intense. And part of it is giving ourselves grace to say, yeah, I usually do that for self-care, but it's kind of fallen off the table for these next few days, weeks, as it is an
yeah.
intense time, and be able to postpone it, and to rely on God's care and on the people around us too. As I think of Moses, he wasn't a pastor of a small church; he had a large group of people, but he was the only one at first who was hearing all of their cases, and they would
Mhm.
line up and have to wait all day for him to do that. And his father-in-law had said, you're burning yourself out. It's going to be better for you and for the community if you have some other people who can help you with that. And it meant then that other people in the community could exercise their gifts, and he didn't have to carry the whole burden, and people didn't have to wait all day. So it was good soul care for him, good self care, and good community care. And I wonder how we might develop that in churches as well, to have that kind of vision for soul care, not just for pastors, but for all of us in the church.
Okay, so you wonder how we might develop that. Do you have an idea for how we might better develop some of that within our churches?
Well, I think part of that is modeling that, developing that in ourselves, and modeling that, and just being free to talk about that.
Mhm.
And part of it is encouraging others to do the same. One church, I wrote a book on self care, four gifts, seeking self care for heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Yeah.
And one church said, well, they would do a worship series on that. They took 4 Sundays for each of the elements and talked about self care as part of loving God and loving our neighbors as ourselves. And how might we do that? So that's one way of encouraging that, developing that in the church, and being deliberate about developing leaders. I know for some, I was fortunate in my church, there were other people on staff that could take over certain things if I was away. And I think in churches where there aren't other staff members, that it becomes, if there are other pastors who can help out in the area. One time, what we did was three of us pastors, we prepared a series, and we prepared one sermon, but we each preached it in the three churches. So that
Yeah.
was one way of kind of sharing the load. But, to work with people in the church to develop some of those speaking gifts, visiting gifts, whatever it is that we need help with. And so to develop, as Moses shared the leadership, to share the leadership that we have been given also, and to share that with others.
Mhm. I hear in some of this just a real need to be intentional and to organize, I guess would be a way to understand, to listen carefully to people. I guess I'm just thinking, just because I work in a church as well, and I'm thinking through some of that as I've been serving in an interim position and just come into a whole new situation. What type of things can we do for soul care as we move ahead? And I can see some things there. I strongly appreciate what you've been saying. Just how will I put this? I should actually be letting you tell me how to put it, so that, but the whole idea of caring for ourselves and caring for our souls, in order that the souls of the church, the people of the church, are also cared for. And if we don't do that, we're in big trouble. Yeah. Okay, you got me thinking here. Sorry, April. I could go on and on, because I have very specific questions that I could ask related to my church, but nevertheless, and I call it my church. It's our church. We enjoy being together. We have our problems, our daily life, but hey, that's good. I still think we need to keep working at it. So, okay, I got carried away there. That was my rant for the day. And I do journal, and I think that's a great soul care thing. Anything else that you would want to say in regards to advice? One of what would you consider to be a primary concern that people need to look at for soul care? Any final things? Because I'm about to shut this down because our time's up, I hate to say.
Well, and that sense of scarcity of time, as I mentioned earlier, and that time pressure is one concern. And I think to develop soul care habits, to encourage that in others, and develop leaders and so on, it also all takes time.
Mhm.
And to allow for that, allow that time for God to work, and in the meantime, be gracious to yourself and to others. But to continue working at that, and allow God to work, and to take that time.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I think our time, unfortunately, is up. And so I want to say thank you very, very much. Very informative. And I will say to those that are listening, read some of your stuff. I read your list of 22, and that was marvelous. And, yeah, you're a good writer, by the way. Just wanted to say that. And I appreciate that very much for what you provide for the church. So thank you. And maybe at some other time, we'll get another time to sit down and do another 100 questions that I have to ask after this. But thank you very much, April.
I would love to do that again. Thanks so much, Ron. Good meeting you, and thank you so much for this opportunity.